Winter in the Middle Ages wasn't something people looked forward to, especially not soldiers. There were no heated tents, no insulated boots, no warm barracks waiting at the end of the day. When armies moved through snow-covered landscapes or camped during a siege, they had to face the cold with what little they had: rough wool, open fires, and a lot of stubbornness. Most of the time, just staying warm was a battle on its own. Hunger, wet clothes, frozen ground, none of it cared if you were a knight or a simple footman. The cold made weapons harder to hold, slowed down movement, and turned even sleep into a risk. But soldiers learned how to adapt. They figured out how to trap heat, how to keep their bodies going, and how to survive nights that could easily kill someone unprepared. In this video, we'll break down how medieval soldiers got through brutal winters, what they wore, how they slept, what they ate, and the small things they did every day to stop the cold from getting the better of them. Number 1. Clothing that made the cold bearable. When winter tightened its grip and the snow blanketed the landscape, medieval soldiers had no choice but to depend on the one thing they could control: what they wore. Unlike modern soldiers with thermal gear and high-tech fabrics, these men relied entirely on materials that came straight from nature. But they weren't clueless. They understood through experience and necessity how to use clothing not just as protection, but as a barrier between their bodies and the brutal cold. And it all started with the very first layer. Linen was the foundation. Every soldier, whether a ragged footman or a well-equipped knight, wore a linen shirt and underdrawers directly against the skin. This wasn't because it was warm, it wasn't, but because it helped keep moisture away. Sweat in cold weather was dangerous. If it soaked into heavier layers, it could chill the body to the core. Linen dried faster than wool and helped keep the rest of the body warmer simply by staying dry. On top of that came layers of wool, not just one tunic, but often two, maybe even three if the weather was harsh. Wool was heavy, itchy, and smelled of lanolin and smoke, but it was reliable. Unlike many materials, it retained heat even when damp, which was a lifesaver during sleet and snow. But the most important piece wasn't the outer cloak or hood. It was the gambeson. This thick, quilted coat, stuffed with anything from wool to horsehair to shredded cloth, wrapped the torso in dense insulation. Though it was designed to absorb blows in combat, its padded structure also made it an excellent defense against the cold. Soldiers who weren't expecting battle sometimes wore the gambeson alone on winter marches because it offered more warmth and flexibility than a suit of chainmail or plate. It wasn't elegant, but it kept you warm and mobile, both essential to staying alive. Fur was another key resource, especially when wool wasn't enough. Soldiers in wealthier armies might have access to lined cloaks, fur mittens, and boots reinforced with rabbit or sheepskin. Those with fewer means got creative. A strip of fox fur around the collar or a piece of goat hide wrapped around boots could mean the difference between fighting and freezing. They knew where the body lost heat: neck, wrists, ankles, and targeted those spots carefully. They wrapped cloth around joints, reinforced their elbows and knees with extra padding, and used whatever they had: leather cords, spare fabric, even rawhide strips to keep the wind out. Everything was done with function in mind. A scarf might not look like much, but a strip of fabric wound across the mouth and nose kept icy air from cutting into the lungs. Hoods weren't just for rain. They trapped heat around the head, and when pulled low, helped sleep through bitter nights. Clothing wasn't just about covering up. It was a system of defense. In a time when there were no coats with zippers, no lined boots, and no heat packs, medieval soldiers built their survival kit one layer at a time, and every stitch counted. Number 2, how they slept without freezing. Trying to get any real sleep during a harsh medieval winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Hypothermia could creep in silently during the night, and there was no mercy from the cold once it settled into your bones. For soldiers far from castles or villages, finding a way to survive until morning meant being clever with what little they had. Most didn't sleep in tents because tents were rare and expensive, often reserved for nobles or high-ranking commanders. The regular fighting man had to work with whatever was around: snow, branches, frozen earth, and maybe a spare cloak if he was lucky. One of the most common and effective tricks was digging into the ground. Soldiers would use knives, helmets, or even bare hands to carve out shallow, body-shaped trenches. These weren't graves, though they probably looked like them. The idea was to get below the level of the wind and let the earth act as a natural wall against the cold air sweeping above. They'd line the bottom with anything they could find: dried grass, straw, piles of leaves, or pine branches if they were in the woods. This layer stopped the frozen soil from leaching the heat from their bodies. Then came the cloak or blanket, tightly wrapped, pulled over the head if needed. Some covered themselves with another layer, more branches, extra clothing, or even their own shields flipped sideways to create a partial cover against falling snow or biting wind. When sleeping completely exposed was the only option, soldiers turned to their equipment. A wide shield became both a ground barrier and a backrest. They wrapped themselves in cloaks, sometimes even doubling up with a comrade to share what little warmth they could generate. Back to back or lying curled up together wasn't about comfort, it was practical. Body heat was a survival resource, and no one wasted it if they wanted to wake up able to move their fingers. In some cases, fires were allowed, though they had to be used carefully. A bright flame could give away a position to an enemy, so in hostile territory, open fires were risky. Still, when they could, they heated small stones near the edge of the fire, wrapped them in cloth or tucked them inside boots, and pressed them against the torso or thighs during sleep. The heat lasted a couple of hours, not enough for the whole night, but enough to stop the shivering long enough to drift into rest. During long sieges or stationary campaigns, soldiers sometimes found shelter in barns, towers, or even underground storage rooms. Packed together in narrow spaces, they shared warmth through proximity. In large organized camps, when tents were available, dozens of men slept under a single canvas. The outer layer might be canvas, but inside it was all about improvisation. Animal hides draped to block cold air, spare clothes hung from the top to trap heat, and shared blankets stretched across bodies like patchwork insulation. The closer you were to the central fire pit, the warmer it was, but no one stayed there all night. They rotated in shifts, knowing that staying too close to the fire meant another man froze on the edge. These weren't accidental habits. They were learned, practiced, passed from older veterans to young recruits. Every soldier who had survived a winter campaign understood that sleep wasn't about comfort. It was about staying alive until the next morning, and in that cold, even small details, like where you put your boots or how tightly you tied your cloak, could make all the difference. Number 3, fueling the body in cold conditions. Marching through snow or standing guard in biting wind wasn't just a test of strength. It was a constant battle to keep the body running. In winter, just staying warm could burn through energy faster than swinging a sword, and medieval soldiers, even if they didn't have a word like calories, understood what their bodies needed. Food wasn't just a routine, it was survival. And in cold weather, they learned quickly that eating the right kind of food at the right time could mean the difference between waking up ready to fight or not waking up at all. Meals in winter were built around one thing: endurance. Soldiers didn't sit down for neat courses or wait for fancy cooking. They needed hot, heavy food that could be made in one pot and shared among many. That's where the stew pot came in. Large iron kettles sat over open fires, sometimes for hours, simmering with whatever they had. Dried beans, barley, scraps of salted meat, bits of root vegetables that hadn't rotted, even stale bread to thicken the mix. This wasn't about taste. It was about putting something warm, solid, and dense into the stomach that would fuel a body through hours of cold and exertion. Fat was the most valued ingredient, not because it tasted good, but because it burned slowly and gave warmth from the inside. Soldiers prized chunks of pork belly, globs of animal lard, hard slabs of tallow, or the occasional knob of butter saved from earlier rations. If a pig had been slaughtered weeks before, the fattiest bits were salted and saved specifically for cold days. Meat on its own was useful, but it didn't provide the long-lasting warmth and stamina that fat did. Even bones were valuable. They boiled them until they cracked open and the marrow oozed out into the broth, thickening it into something closer to fuel than food. Hot drinks helped too. Not because they were special, but because anything warm gave the illusion of comfort and helped raise body temperature from within. Broth, warm ale, or watered-down wine all served that purpose. On particularly cold nights, soldiers soaked bits of cloth in hot water and pressed them against their necks or chests to chase away the chill before sleep. But there were days when rations ran low, or supply lines failed, or the army moved too fast for proper camp cooking. That's when they improvised. Small animals were hunted, birds shot down with arrows or stones, rabbits snared if traps were on hand. They cooked what they caught whole, often singed over a flame without even gutting, because there wasn't time or warmth to spare. The meat was shared quickly, often torn apart by hand and passed around. Soldiers in pairs or groups took turns chewing whatever they could get. They didn't complain, they just needed enough to make it to the next day. Number 4, fires, wind tricks, and campcraft. Fire in winter wasn't just about comfort. It was the core of every functioning camp, the invisible boundary between survival and disaster. But starting a fire when everything around you is soaked, frozen, or buried in snow took more than luck. It took experience, preparation, and a bit of creativity. Soldiers on winter campaigns couldn't just rely on one way of doing things. They had to adapt to the environment with whatever tools, terrain, and materials they had on hand. And that's exactly what they did. One of the first things a seasoned soldier did when the unit stopped for the night was scan the area for both fuel and shelter potential. Building a fire meant more than just lighting a spark. It meant preparing a space that could actually hold and protect the heat. Often, they dug shallow pits in the ground and lined the bottom and sides with flat stones. These stones weren't there for looks. They absorbed and radiated heat back slowly, allowing the warmth to linger longer. Soldiers would place damp sticks or semi-frozen wood near the hot rocks to dry them out gradually before tossing them into the flames. It was a slow process, but one that worked even when kindling was nearly useless. If the camp was set up near a wooded area, they took full advantage. Lean-tos were quickly thrown together using tree branches and available fabric. Simple structures leaned against trunks that provided a bit of shelter from wind and snow. Behind the fire, they often stacked logs or built a rough wall to act as a reflector, bouncing heat forward rather than letting it drift off uselessly into the cold night. In high-risk areas where the glow of flames could draw enemy eyes, they went low-tech and clever. By digging 2 holes and connecting them underground with a narrow passage, they built what we'd now call a Dakota fire hole. 1 hole for the fire, 1 for air intake. It was nearly smokeless, easy to hide, and surprisingly efficient. Wind was relentless, so controlling it became part of the craft. They set up camp behind natural barriers like boulders, hills, or tree lines. If there was no natural cover, they built their own. Snow walls, stacked shields, even rows of spears driven into the ground and layered with cloaks or sacks to block the gusts. In mountainous areas or near the coast, they huddled under overhangs, took shelter in caves, or camped deep in valleys where the wind couldn't reach. Large fires looked dramatic, but were rarely used unless the army was completely out of danger. Smaller fires were smarter. They took less fuel, gave off less smoke, and could be spread across the camp to warm more people. They were easy to control, and if they had to break camp in a hurry, they could stamp them out fast. Fire maintenance wasn't casual. A rotation was set. Someone was always watching the embers, adding fuel, adjusting logs, keeping it alive without letting it blaze too high. Flint and steel were standard gear, but dry tinder was precious. To keep it usable, soldiers carried it close to their bodies, often tucked inside boots, pouches, or wrapped in cloth and tied around the thigh. When proper kindling ran out, they got inventive. Bits of frayed rope, scraps of scorched linen, dried moss, even powdered dung. All of it could be used to catch a spark. Nothing was wasted, and no one wanted to be the one responsible for a cold, dark camp, because they let the last ember die out. Fire meant heat. Light the ability to cook and stay awake. And every man understood that without it, the cold would win. Number 5, staying alive. Through movement and mindset. In brutal medieval winters, warmth didn't come only from cloaks or fires. It came from movement, instinct, and the mental grit to keep going when everything around you begged you to stop. Soldiers didn't have the luxury of sitting still. The cold wasn't passive, it crept into your joints, stole feeling from your fingers, and turned even standing still into a kind of slow death. The men who lasted longest were the ones who understood that the body couldn't be allowed to rest too long. Not because of fatigue, but because stillness let the cold in. Movement was constant, even if it was small. A soldier resting by the fire might still be shifting his weight from foot to foot, rolling his shoulders, flexing fingers inside stiff gloves, or stomping boots to keep blood from slowing down. Those who stood watch couldn't just stand like statues. They walked in tight circles, bounced on their heels, clutched their arms, and rubbed warmth into their skin. Tasks around camp weren't just chores, they were survival drills. Gathering wood, clearing snow, tending horses, repairing gear. All of it kept the blood moving, the muscles warm, and the mind from going dull. No one volunteered to be idle for long in the middle of winter. Boots were always a weak spot. Most were simple leather, not designed for water or snow, and once wet, they turned into ice boxes around your feet. To deal with that, soldiers stuffed their boots with dry straw, moss, scraps of fabric, anything that could insulate against the cold. Some used long foot wraps, winding strips of cloth tightly around their feet and ankles, not only for warmth, but to prevent blisters on long marches. These wraps had to be changed often. Wet ones invited frostbite. Grease made from animal fat was rubbed into boots regularly to help repel snow and slush. But even then, no one expected dry feet. Just less freezing. But warmth wasn't just physical. The mental side of surviving a medieval winter campaign was just as critical. The cold could break a man down in ways a sword never could. And the only thing more valuable than gear or food was morale. Soldiers who had seen more than one winter knew that keeping spirits alive kept bodies moving. They joked when they could, sang in low voices during night watches, and shared what they had, even if it was only a crumb of bread or a scrap of dry cloth. They formed unspoken bonds. A soldier who kept his fire going might warm another man's hands. A cloak might be draped across 2 shoulders instead of 1. Kindness wasn't sentiment, it was practicality. No one made it through winter alone. Even in the worst moments, under siege with food nearly gone and fires burning low, soldiers found strange and sometimes desperate ways to adapt. Wrapping parchment around legs for insulation, using hardened cloth soaked in urine to block wind, or stuffing gloves with horsehair or feathers scavenged from camp animals. These weren't tactics from manuals. These were passed down by those who had done it before, who had survived by trial and error. What worked was kept and taught quietly to the next man who needed it. They didn't talk about survival like it was heroic. It was just necessary. No one expected comfort, but they all knew that staying alive meant staying sharp, staying warm, and never letting the cold take more than it had to. That kind of knowledge wasn't flashy, but in the dark, frozen silence between battles, it was the only thing that mattered.